40. The salt was the first thing Cale knew each morning. It was a taste on his lips, a crust on his skin, a constant, sharp perfume in the air he breathed. It was the lifeblood of his people, the Gara, the tribe that lived between the towering granite cliffs and the endless, churning expanse of the Great Sea. For generations, they had clung to this rugged coastline, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the tides, the migration of seals, and the bounty of the cold, gray water. Cale was young, his beard still a patchy suggestion on his jawline, his shoulders broad but not yet filled with the heavy, knotted muscle of the tribe's elder hunters. He was known for his quietness and the keenness of his eyes, which often saw things others missed. The subtle shift in a current that signaled a school of fish, the faint depression in the sand that marked a buried clutch of turtle eggs. But this quiet observation was often mistaken for hesitation, for a lack of the bold, brute fire that defined men like Boar. Boar was the sun around which the younger hunters orbited. His laughter was a booming roar that echoed in the great cave. His arms were as thick as driftwood logs, and his spear always found its mark. He led the hunting parties, his dugout canoe, the wave crasher, always the first to return, laden with heavy seals or a prized porpoise. Boar saw Cale's thoughtful pauses as weakness, his slender build as a sign of frailty. The sea rewards the bold little Cale, he would often jest, clapping a hand on Cale's shoulder that was heavy enough to make him stumble. It does not feed those who stare at it. This morning, the tension between them was a palpable thing, as thick as the morning fog clinging to the water's surface. The tribe was hungry. The winter storms had been fierce, keeping the canoes beached for many days, and the stores of dried fish and smoked seal meat were dwindling to almost nothing. The sea, usually their generous mother, had become a wrathful god, smashing their fishing weirs and driving the game into the deeps. Now, with the first break in the weather, desperation was a sharp pang in every belly. Turok, the chief, a man whose face was a roadmap of seasons and sorrows, stood on the high ledge overlooking the bay. His gaze was fixed on the water, his brow furrowed. "The sea is calm," he declared, his voice a low rumble. "Too calm. It is a hungry calm. Boar, take the hunters. We need meat." Boar slammed his fist into his palm, a grin splitting his bearded face. "We will not return empty, Turok. The Gara will feast tonight." He turned, his eyes sweeping over the assembled hunters, landing on Cale, who was checking the sinew lashings on his flint-tipped spear. "You come, Cale. Try to keep up. Perhaps you will learn how to catch more than a sand crab." A few of the other young men snickered. Cale's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his gaze dropping to his work. He felt the familiar sting of shame, but it was quickly replaced by a cold knot of unease. Turok was right. The sea felt different. The air lacked the familiar cries of gulls, and the usual pods of playful dolphins were nowhere to be seen. The water of Whispering Bay, usually a vibrant slate blue, had taken on a dark, almost oily sheen. They launched 3 canoes, each a hollowed-out log shaped and hardened with fire and stone adzes. Boar's canoe led the way, 8 of the strongest paddlers driving it through the surf. Cale was in the second canoe, captained by a steady, older hunter named Fend. He felt more at ease with Fend, a man who valued precision over posturing. They paddled for hours, past the familiar kelp forests and rocky outcrops. The silence was unnerving. The sea, their larder, was empty. No flashes of silver beneath the hull, no dark shapes of seals sunning themselves on the rocks. The hunters grew restless, their banter fading into grim muttering. "The sea spirits are angry," whispered a young hunter near Cale. "The shamans did not give a great enough offering." Fend grunted, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The sea does not have spirits. It has moods, and this is a foul one." It was Boar, ever impatient, who made the fateful decision. He pointed his spear far out, towards the jagged line of the serpent's spine, a treacherous reef that was usually forbidden territory. It was a place of deadly currents and hidden, boat-splintering rocks. The deep water beyond the spine, Bor roared across the water. That is where the big fish are hiding. The cowards stay in the shallows. The Gera hunt where the monsters dwell. Fenn's face hardened. That is folly, Bor. The tide will turn soon. The currents in the spine will crush us. The tide waits for no man, old Fend, but it will not turn for hours yet. Bor shot back, his voice dripping with scorn. Stay here and weave baskets if you wish. My men and I will bring back a feast fit for chiefs. With a powerful whoop, Bor's crew dug their paddles deep, and the wave crasher surged forward, a spearhead aimed at the heart of the danger zone. Fend cursed under his breath, shaking his head. Pride will be the end of that one. But the desperation of the tribe was a heavy weight. If Bor found fish, they had to be there to help. Reluctantly, Fend gave the order to follow, though at a more cautious distance. The third canoe followed them. As they neared the serpent's spine, the water grew darker, deeper. The sheer cliffs of the mainland seemed to shrink behind them. Here the sea was king. Cale could feel the power of it. A deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the hull of the canoe and up into his bones. He gripped his spear, his knuckles white, his senses on high alert. He scanned the water not for fish, but for something else. He did not know what, but the feeling of being watched was immense, a pressure on the back of his neck. They saw Bor's canoe stop. A cheer went up across the water. They had found something. Cale's canoe and the third one paddled faster, their own hopes surging. As they drew closer, they saw Bor and his men wrestling with their heavy nets. The ropes were taut, straining, and the side of their canoe was pulled dangerously low to the water. "It is a giant ray," one of Bor's men shouted, his voice ecstatic. "Bigger than any I have ever seen." But then, something went wrong. The taut net suddenly went slack. For a moment, Bor's canoe bobbed, unstably. Then the water around it began to boil, not with the thrashing of a ray, but with a slow, powerful, concentric churning, as if something of impossible size were rising from the abyssal depths below. A shadow, vast and circular, eclipsed the deep blue. It was larger than all three canoes put together. It was not a ray. It was not a whale. It was something else entirely. Fenn screamed a single word, "Back!" The paddlers in Cale's canoe reacted instantly, their panic lending them strength. They dug their paddles in, trying to reverse their course, their eyes wide with terror. But they were too late to do anything but watch. From the center of the churning water, a head emerged. It was not the sleek head of a shark or the blunt head of a whale. It was reptilian, armored with plates of glistening, obsidian-like scales. Two eyes, each the size of a man's shield, opened. They were not the black, soulless eyes of a fish, but the intelligent, malevolent eyes of a predator, glowing with a deep internal fire like molten gold. Its maw opened, a cavern of darkness lined with rows of teeth like jagged shards of flint, each as long as a man's forearm. The creature was a legend made flesh, a nightmare given form. It was Forelag, the great devourer, the serpent of the deeps, a story the elders told to frighten children, a myth from the time of their ancestors. But it was real. Forelag paid no mind to the other two canoes. Its golden eyes were fixed on the wave crasher. Bor, for the first time in his life, was frozen. Not with courage, but with pure, uncomprehending terror. He stood in his canoe, his spear held limply, his mouth agape. The Leviathan struck. It was not a frenzied attack. It was slow, deliberate, and absolute. It did not smash the canoe. It rose beneath it, lifting the entire vessel out of the water as if it were a child's toy. The men screamed, tumbling into the churning sea. Forlag's great head dipped down, and its jaws closed. The sound was not a crunch of wood, but a wet, final, sickening snap. The wave crasher and half of its crew vanished into that monstrous gullet. The remaining men flailed in the water, their screams cut short as the creature's immense, serpentine body coiled and swept them under. Bor was the last one. He was treading water, his face a mask of shock. He looked across the water and his eyes met Cale's. In that instant, all the arrogance, all the pride was gone. There was only terror. Forlag's tail, a colossal finned appendage as wide as the great cave's entrance, rose from the water. It hung there for a heartbeat, blotting out the sun, before it came down with the force of a collapsing cliff. The sound was a deafening boom that echoed back to the shore. The water where Bor had been erupted in a geyser of white foam and red mist. And then silence. A silence more profound and terrifying than any sound. The great beast submerged, leaving behind only the placid, oily water, a few splintered pieces of a canoe, and a spreading crimson stain that was quickly swallowed by the gray. The hunters in the remaining 2 canoes were paralyzed, their minds unable to process the cataclysm they had witnessed. Fend was the first to break, his voice a choked, ragged whisper. "Paddle, paddle for the shore. Paddle for your lives." The journey back was a silent, frantic blur. No one spoke. The only sound was the desperate slap of paddles against the water and the ragged, gasping breaths of terrified men. They did not look behind them. They did not dare. They could feel the presence of the beast in the deeps below, a cold weight of dread that followed them all the way back to the sands of Whispering Bay. When they stumbled ashore, their faces were ashen, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Tarak and the rest of the tribe rushed to meet them, their questions dying on their lips as they saw the 2 empty canoes, the missing men, the sheer horror etched onto the survivors' faces. "Bor?" Tarak asked, his voice trembling. "Where is Bor's crew?" Fend fell to his knees on the sand, burying his face in his hands. "Gone," he wept. "All gone. Devoured." That night there was no feast. There was no fire in the center of the great cave, only the low-burning tallow lamps that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the ancient paintings of hunts seem like mocking ghosts. The tribe huddled together, a single body united by cold, by hunger, and by a new, primordial fear they had never known. The wails of the women who had lost their sons, their mates, their brothers, were a thin, heartbreaking sound against the mournful roar of the sea. Kale sat apart, near the mouth of the cave, the cold stone at his back. The image of Forlag's golden eye was burned into his mind. He could still see Bor's face in that final moment. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction at his rival's demise. He only felt a hollow, aching void and a fear so profound it felt like a physical sickness. The sea, their mother, their provider, had birthed a demon. As the others grieved, Kale found his feet. He walked to the far wall of the great cave, to a section that was always dark, ignored by the daily life of the tribe. Here, the paintings were older, faded, covered in a thin layer of grime. He held his lamp close. The other paintings showed hunts of seals, mammoths, great birds. They were celebrations of triumph. But these were different. His eyes traced the faint ochre and charcoal lines. He saw canoes much like their own. He saw men with spears. And he saw what they were fighting. It was a serpent. A monstrous, impossibly long sea serpent with a horned head and a vast, gaping mouth. In one faded scene, the serpent was coiled around a rock, crushing a canoe in its jaws. In another, men were being thrown into the air by a great tail. It was Forlag. The elders' stories were not stories. They were history. They were a warning. His heart pounded. His people had faced this beast before generations ago. He moved his lamp further along the wall, his breath catching in his throat. He found a different image, a larger, more detailed painting. It showed the same serpent, but this time it was bleeding from a dozen wounds. It was trapped, caught among jagged rocks that looked chillingly like the serpent's spine. And the men, they were not in the water. They were on the cliffs above, hurling down massive, weighted spears tied with thick ropes. A flicker of something, not yet hope, but a fragile spark of an idea ignited in the depths of Kale's despair. They had fought it, and from the look of this painting they had won. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, turning to see the tribe's eldest, Elara. Her face was a web of deep wrinkles, her eyes clouded with cataracts but still holding a piercing intelligence. She did not speak of the hunt or of the dead. She only looked at the ancient painting Kale was staring at. "The ancestors knew," she rasped, her voice thin and dry like rustling leaves. "They knew that to fight the serpent in its home, the deep water, is to offer yourself as a sacrifice. You do not fight a storm by sailing into its heart. You do not fight a rockslide by standing at the bottom of the cliff." She pointed a bony finger at the painting. "They did not kill it with brute strength alone, boy. They killed it with rock, and with tide, and with knowledge. They used the sea's own teeth against its child." Kale looked from the ancient painting to the old woman's face, then back again. The images swam before his eyes. Boar's terrified face, the golden eye of the Leviathan, the men on the cliffs, the ropes, the trap. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut. But now it was mixed with something else. A dawning realization, a terrible, heavy, and undeniable purpose. Boar had been wrong. The sea did not reward the bold. Not this sea. Not anymore. This sea demanded something more. It demanded cunning. It demanded patience. It demanded a hunter who understood not just the spear, but the world itself. Outside, a storm began to brew, and the waves crashed against the shore with a sound like a hungry growl. The shadow of Forlag lay upon the water, and upon the hearts of the Gara. But here, in the flickering lamplight, in the presence of an ancient warning, Kale felt the first stirrings of a plan. It was a desperate, terrifying plan, one that would require him to become someone he had never been. Not a quiet observer, but a leader. Not a boy in Boar's shadow, but a man who could face a god. The age of the hunter was over. The age of the monster slayer had begun. The days that followed the massacre were a slow, grinding descent into a new kind of hell. The fear was a physical presence, a cold mist that seeped from the sea and settled deep into the bones of the Gara. No canoes were launched. No nets were cast. The shore, once a bustling hub of life and activity, became a dead zone. The children no longer played in the tidal pools, and the women who gathered seaweed and shellfish did so in fearful, huddled groups, never straying far from the looming safety of the cliffs, their eyes constantly scanning the gray, inscrutable surface of the water. Hunger, once a sharp pang, became a dull, constant ache. The last of the dried meat was gone, rationed out in pitifully small portions. The tribe subsisted on tough roots dug from the thin soil atop the cliffs, a few scrawny birds caught in snares, and the bitter-tasting lichens scraped from the rocks. The vibrant energy of the Gara was replaced by a listless lethargy. The fire in the great cave burned low, and the stories and songs that once filled the nights died in their throats. Despair was a sickness, and it was spreading faster than any plague. Chief Tarak seemed to age a decade in a handful of days. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him, stooping his once proud shoulders. He would stand for hours on the high ledge, a solitary, powerless figure staring out at the hostile sea that held his people hostage. His authority, once absolute, was beginning to fray. The survivors of the hunt were broken men, haunted by what they had seen, their nights filled with thrashing nightmares. Their terror was infectious, a constant, whispered reminder of the monster that lurked in the deeps. The tribe began to fracture. Two distinct camps emerged from the miasma of fear. One faction, led by a grizzled elder named Grohl, argued for abandonment. "This land is cursed," he would proclaim, his voice shaking with conviction. "The sea has turned against us. We must leave this place, go inland. We can learn to hunt the forest beasts. To stay here is to wait for death." His words resonated with many, especially the mothers who clutched their starving children. The idea of leaving their ancestral home, the only world they had ever known, was terrifying, but the idea of staying was becoming unbearable. The other faction was born of rage and grief. It was a smaller, more volatile group, comprised of the younger brothers and kin of the men who were lost. Their de facto leader was a young, hot-headed hunter named Jorn, Boar's closest friend. Their grief had curdled into a thirst for vengeance. "We are Gara," Jorn would shout, his eyes wild. "We do not run. We fight. We will take every canoe, every spear, and we will hunt this beast. We will drive our spears into its black heart and avenge our brothers." It was a suicidal, grief-maddened cry, but it appealed to the wounded pride of the tribe's warriors. Turok was paralyzed between these two impossible choices: a slow death by starvation or a swift one in the jaws of the Leviathan. The councils became shouting matches, devolving into bitter accusations and recriminations. The unity of the Gera was crumbling to dust. Throughout this turmoil, Kale remained an observer, but a different kind of observer than before. His silence was no longer that of hesitation, but of deep, consuming thought. He spent his days away from the bickering and the despair, walking the high cliffs, his eyes not on the horizon, but on the geography of the bay itself. He studied the way the tide ebbed and flowed through the narrow channels of the serpent's spine. He watched how the waves crashed and broke against the jagged rocks. He paced the shoreline, measuring distances with his strides, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and possibilities. His nights were spent in the dark, quiet corner of the great cave, in front of the ancient paintings. With Alara at his side, he traced the faded lines with his fingers, trying to decipher the wisdom of his ancestors. "They were clever," Alara would rasp, her breath smelling of roots and winter. "Look here." She pointed her gnarled finger at the depiction of the trapped serpent. "The tide. It is everything. See how the water is shown as low around the beast? They did not fight it in the deeps. They brought the deeps to the shallows, and then they let the water abandon it." Kale saw it too. The plan forming in his mind was monstrous in its audacity, a delicate dance of timing, courage, and engineering that seemed almost impossible. But it was the only path he could see that wasn't a direct line to extinction. Finally, he knew he could wait no longer. The tribe was at a breaking point. During a particularly heated council, as Jorn and Grohl were nearly coming to blows, Kale stepped into the center of the firelight. "Enough!" His voice was not loud, but it cut through the din with a clarity that surprised everyone, including himself. All eyes turned to him. In the flickering light, he no longer looked like a boy. There was a new hardness in his gaze, a focus that commanded attention. "Grohl is right," Kale began, and a murmur of surprise went through the crowd. "To stay here and do nothing is to starve. And Jorn is right. We cannot run. This is our home. The Gera do not flee." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But to attack the beast in the open sea is not vengeance. It is suicide. We have already seen that." Jorn sneered. "And what does the boy who stares at crabs suggest we do? Shall we ask the monster to leave?" Kale met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said, his voice steady. "We are going to kill it, but not on its terms. On ours." Over the next hour, holding a piece of charcoal and using the smooth floor of the cave as his slate, Kale laid out his plan. He spoke with a passion and precision no one had ever heard from him before. He described the king tides, the highest tides of the year, which were due with the next full moon. He explained how the waters of a king tide would be just high enough to allow a creature of foreleg's size to enter the labyrinthine channels of the serpent's spine. "We will not hunt it," Kale explained, drawing a map of the reef. "We will lure it. We will be the bait. We will draw it into the trap. And when the tide turns, the sea itself will be our cage. The water will recede, leaving it stranded, or nearly so, among the rocks. Its greatest strength, the deep water, will be taken from it. It will be vulnerable, exposed." A hush fell over the cave. The sheer, insane brilliance of the idea was stunning. But then the doubts began to surface. "Lure it," Grohl scoffed. "With what? A canoe? It will swallow the canoe and everyone in it before you get halfway to the reef." "And what then?" Jorn demanded. "Even if it is trapped, how do we kill it? Our spears bounced off its hide like pebbles. It is armored in rock." These were the questions Kale had been waiting for. He turned to the ancient painting on the wall. "Our ancestors have already shown us the way. We will not fight it from the water. We will fight it from the cliffs." He then described the weapons they would need to build. Not spears, but harpoons. Massive harpoons with shafts as thick as a man's arm, carved from the heartwood of the ironwood trees that grew in the sheltered valleys behind the cliffs. The heads would not be mere flint spear points, but huge, barbed heads of the sharpest obsidian, each one the size of a man's head, chipped and knapped with painstaking care. And the ropes. They would need ropes of immense size and strength, braided from every usable vine, every strip of hide, every fiber the tribe possessed. These ropes would be tied to the harpoons, their other ends anchored to the largest boulders on the clifftops. "We will strike from above," Cale declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "The weight of the harpoons will help them punch through the thinner scales on its back. The barbs will hold fast. The ropes will anchor it. It will be pinned, unable to escape when the tide falls. Then, and only then, can we kill it." The tribe was silent, staring at him. He was not just offering a plan, he was offering a vision. It was a vision of defiance, of ingenuity, of hope. It was a chance to be Gara again, not victims, but masters of their own fate. Tarak, the chief, looked from Cale to the painting, and then to the faces of his people. He saw the spark in their eyes, the first he had seen in many days. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Cale's shoulder. It was not a heavy, condescending clap like Boar's had been. It was a gesture of respect, of succession. "Your father would be proud, Cale," Tarak said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was a wise man. The wisdom lives on in you. We will do this. We will forge these weapons. We will follow your plan." The decision was made. A new energy surged through the tribe, born of desperate purpose. The next 2 weeks were a blur of feverish activity, a monumental effort that consumed every waking moment. The division and despair were burned away in the forge of their new work. The tribe became a single, functioning organism again. The strongest men, led by Fend, ventured into the woods to fell the giant ironwood trees. The sound of their stone axes striking would echoed through the valley from dawn till dusk. They dragged the massive logs back to the cave, their muscles straining, their chants of effort replacing the wails of grief. The women and elders, under Ilara's direction, became rope makers. They gathered every type of vine, stripped bark from supple trees, and cut the remaining sealskins into long, thin strips. They sat in a great circle, their hands a blur of motion as they twisted and braided the fibers together, creating ropes thicker than a man's leg. It was slow, agonizing work that left their hands raw and bleeding, but they did not stop. The most skilled flint-knappers, once Jorn's loudest supporters, now worked under Cale's direct instruction. Cale had a feel for the stone, an instinct for where to strike to achieve the sharpest edge, the most lethal point. He showed them how to create the massive, barbed harpoon heads. The sharp crack of stone on stone was a constant, percussive rhythm in the great cave, a song of defiance. Jorn, humbled and finding a new purpose, became Cale's most dedicated apprentice, his hot-headed anger channeled into focused, powerful blows. A grudging respect grew between the two young men, forged in the dust of their shared work. Cale was everywhere. He oversaw the carving of the harpoon shafts, ensuring their balance. He tested the strength of the ropes, organizing teams of men to pull on them in a great tug of war. He directed the sharpening of the obsidian heads. He had shed his quiet skin and emerged as a leader, not through booming commands, but through quiet competence, clear vision, and a tireless work ethic that inspired everyone around him. He ate little, slept less, his mind constantly refining the details of the plan. As the full moon grew fat in the night sky, the arsenal was completed. 10 colossal harpoons lay in a row, their obsidian heads gleaming darkly in the firelight. Beside them lay great coils of immense rope. The Gara looked upon their work with a mixture of awe and terror. They had created weapons to fight a god. The day before the Kingtide, Cale gathered the hunting party leaders, Fend, Jorn, and a few other seasoned warriors. He took them to the clifftops overlooking the serpent's spine. "This is our battleground," he said, pointing down at the jagged rocks and swirling currents. He assigned each team their position. Jorn, you will take the 5 best throwers here at the highest point. You will have the first and most important shots. Fend, your team will be here to the west to strike if it turns. My team will be there. He pointed to a lower, more precarious ledge, closer to the entrance of the channel. Then he turned to the most dangerous task. We need bait. 1 canoe, small and fast, to get its attention and lead it into the channel. Silence. Every man knew it was a suicide mission. I will do it, Jorn said, his voice quiet. I owe it to Boar. I owe it to my brothers. Kale shook his head. No. Your arm is needed on the cliffs. You are our best thrower. He looked at the faces of the men, then back at the sea. I will do it. I will take the bait canoe. A protest rose from Fend, but Kale cut him off. It must be me. I understand the currents. I know the timing. And Forlag knows me. I saw it. It saw me. This is between us. There was a finality in his voice that allowed no argument. That night, a strange calm fell over the tribe. The work was done. The plan was set. There was nothing left to do but wait for the tide and for the monster. They gathered for a solemn meal of roasted roots and shellfish. Tarak stood and raised a cup of fresh water. Tomorrow, he said, his voice resonating in the quiet cave. We face the serpent. Some of us may fall. But we will not fall as victims. We will fall as warriors of the Gera. We fight for our children, for our home, for the memory of our ancestors. And we fight under the leadership of a new kind of warrior. Not a warrior of the spear alone, but a warrior of the mind. To Kale! To Kale! The tribe echoed, a unified, powerful roar. Kale felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders, the trust of his entire people. He looked at their faces, etched with fear but also with a fierce, burning determination. They had come back from the brink of despair. They had forged more than just weapons. They had reforged their own spirit. He stepped out of the cave and looked up at the full moon, a perfect, white disk in the black sky. It cast a silver path across the water, a path that led directly to the dark, waiting maw of the serpent's spine. The king tide was coming, and with it, their final, desperate chance at salvation. The fear was still there, a cold dread coiling in his stomach, but now it was tempered with a will of iron. He was ready. The dawn of the king tide broke gray and ominous. A heavy, wet mist clung to the cliffs, muffling sound and shrouding the world in a ghostly pallor. The sea was unnaturally calm and swollen, the water level already lapping at rocks it hadn't touched in a year. An electric tension crackled in the air, a silent, shared understanding that this day would decide the fate of the Gera. There would be no other chances. There were no grand speeches, no boisterous cries. The tribe moved with a quiet, grim purpose, each person knowing their role. The teams of harpooners, led by Jorn and Fend, began the arduous task of hauling the massive weapons and their coiled ropes up the winding, treacherous paths to the cliff tops overlooking the serpent's spine. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their faces set like stone. Kale stood on the beach with the 2 men who had volunteered to join him in the bait canoe, a swift, light vessel named the Sea Dart. They were young, but their eyes held a veteran's resolve. One was Liam, a silent boy whose sister had been betrothed to one of the men lost with Boar. The other was Ren, a fast paddler known for his calm under pressure. They did not speak. They simply checked their paddles and the lashings of the small canoe one last time. Alara approached Kale, her ancient face seeming to hold the sorrow of generations. She pressed a small, smooth, black stone into his hand. An ancestor's charm, she rasped. From the first man who survived the serpent's attack. It will not turn a tooth, but it may guide your spirit. Kale closed his hand around the stone. It was cool and solid, a tangible link to the past, to those who had faced this same terror and somehow endured. He nodded to the old woman, a wordless thank you. Tarak clasped his arm. Survive, Kale. The Gera need you. Kale looked at his chief, at the faces of his people watching from the mouth of the great cave, and then out at the gray, waiting sea. "The Gara will survive," he said, his voice low but firm. With a shared nod, he, Liam, and Run pushed the sea dart into the unervingly high water. The canoe felt small and fragile, a single leaf on a vast, hungry ocean. They paddled out, their strokes synchronized and powerful, heading towards the open sea beyond the reef. Their mission was twofold. First, they had to get the monster's attention. Second, they had to survive long enough to lead it into the trap. The wait was agonizing. They drifted in the eerie silence, the mist swirling around them. The world was reduced to their small canoe and the endless gray water. Every ripple, every shadow beneath the surface, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Cale's veins. He held his position at the prow, a single spear in his hand not as a weapon, but as a tool to make noise. He began to strike the side of the canoe with the butt of his spear, a rhythmic, hollow thump, thump, thump that echoed across the water. It was the sound of a wounded animal, a dinner bell for a predator. He slammed his spear against the water, sending splashes high into the air. Liam and Rin joined in, beating their paddles against the surface. They were making themselves as loud, as obnoxious, as noticeable as possible. For a long time there was nothing. The fear began to curdle with doubt. What if it wasn't there? What if it had moved on? A part of Cale prayed for this, even as he knew it would doom his tribe to a slow starvation. Then the sea changed. It began subtly. A change in the current, a deep, almost subsonic vibration that hummed through the canoe's hull. The water ahead of them darkened, the placid surface swelling upwards in a smooth, oily bulge. "It is here," Cale breathed, his voice tight. The head of Forelag broke the surface. It rose silently, water cascading from its obsidian plates. Its molten gold eyes, ancient and intelligent, fixed on the tiny canoe. There was no rage in them yet, only a cold, predatory curiosity, like a cat watching a mouse. It had remembered them. "Now," Cale commanded, his voice steady despite the hammer of his heart. "Paddle, not too fast. Let it." Liam and Ren dug their paddles in, their movements economical and controlled, suppressing the instinct to flee in a blind panic. The sea dart began to move towards the shore, towards the gap in the serpent's spine that marked the entrance to the trap. Forelag followed. It didn't swim. It flowed, an unstoppable river of muscle and malice. It stayed 100 paces behind them, toying with them, its immense head a constant, terrifying presence in their wake. Cale could feel its intelligence, its arrogance. It knew they were no threat. This was a game to it. As they approached the reef, the real danger began. The king tide was rushing through the narrow channels, creating a maelstrom of whirlpools and standing waves. Navigating it in a small canoe was a death-defying act in itself. "Left!" Cale shouted, seeing a whirlpool form ahead. "Hard left!" Run and Liam responded instantly, their paddles a blur as they steered the canoe through the churning water. A wave crashed over the side, flooding the bottom of the boat, but they did not falter. Behind them, Forelag entered the channel. The great beast was so large that its passage displaced a huge amount of water, creating a powerful surge that pushed them forward, threatening to smash them against the rocks. They were in the trap. High above on the cliffs, Jorn watched, his knuckles white as he gripped his massive harpoon. He saw the tiny canoe, the monstrous head following it. "Hold!" he commanded his men, his voice a low growl. "Wait for Cale's signal. Wait until it is in the center." The journey through the channel was a nightmare of controlled chaos. Cale guided them through the aquatic maze, his knowledge of the reef the only thing keeping them alive. They shot through narrow gaps, skirted jagged, half-submerged rocks, and fought against treacherous cross-currents. All the while, the Leviathan was behind them, getting closer, its patience wearing thin. Finally, they reached the heart of the trap, a wider basin surrounded on all sides by high cliffs and jagged rock spires. This was the killing ground. "Now!" Cale roared, his voice carrying up to the cliffs. It was the signal. He turned and faced the beast. Forelag was no longer playing. It seemed to realize it had been led. Its golden eyes narrowed, and a low guttural roar, like rock grinding against rock, issued from its throat. It surged forward, its great maw opening to swallow them whole. At that moment, from the cliffs above, the first harpoon fell. It was thrown by Jorn, a perfect arc of power and precision. The massive ironwood shaft, heavier than a man, plummeted downwards. It struck Forelag on the back, just behind its armored head. There was a sickening crunch as the immense obsidian point, backed by the sheer weight of the weapon, punched through the thick scales. Forelag screamed, a sound of pure agony and fury that shook the very cliffs. It was a sound no one in the tribe would ever forget. It thrashed wildly, its colossal body convulsing, turning the basin into a churning cauldron of white water. A second harpoon fell, then a third. One, from Fenn's team, found its mark in the creature's flank. Another glanced off the thick armor of its skull with a shower of sparks. The ropes attached to the embedded harpoons snapped taut, groaning under the strain. The great boulders they were tied to shifted and scraped on the cliff tops. The sea dart was thrown into the air by the creature's violent thrashing. Kale, Liam, and Run were flung into the raging water. Kale surfaced, gasping for air, the cold of the sea a shocking blow. He saw Liam clinging to a rock, but Run was gone, pulled under by the vortex of the beast's rage. Kale ignored his own safety. He swam, fighting the current, towards the base of the cliff. Forelag was a whirlwind of destruction. It coiled and smashed its body against the rocks of the reef, trying to dislodge the harpoons. The water was turning red from its wounds. But the weapons held. The ancient plan was working. More harpoons rained down. The men on the cliffs worked like demons, reloading and throwing with a desperate, unified strength. Then 5 harpoons were embedded in the monster's flesh. It was pinned, anchored to the cliffs on all sides. Its movements became more sluggish, hampered by the ropes and its own grievous wounds. And now the tide began to turn. The sea, their ally, began its retreat. The water level in the basin started to drop, slowly but inexorably. Forelag, feeling the water recede from under it, went into a final, terrifying frenzy. Its great tail, the same tail that had obliterated Boar, rose from the water and smashed down on a rock spire, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Kale had pulled himself onto a low, slippery ledge, his spear still clutched in his hand. He saw the beast struggle, the ebbing tide. It was weakened, but it was far from dead. The hide was too thick. The harpoons had wounded it, pinned it, but they wouldn't be enough to kill it before it broke the ropes or the tide returned. Then he saw it. As the creature thrashed, it exposed a section of its underbelly near the gills, a place where the scales were smaller, softer, a pale, almost white color, a vulnerability. But to reach it, he would have to get close, suicidally close. He didn't hesitate. He saw Jorn on the cliff above, preparing for another throw. Kale raised his arm and pointed with his spear, signaling the weak spot. Jorn saw him, and his eyes widened in understanding. But the angle was impossible from the cliffs. It had to be a blow from below. Jorn looked at Kale, and in that moment, the last vestiges of their rivalry vanished, replaced by a warrior's salute. He knew what Kale was about to do. Kale took a deep breath, the charm stone a hard knot in his fist. He slipped back into the bloody, churning water. He swam towards the dying Leviathan, his movements shielded by the chaos. He was a flea approaching a mountain. He reached the creature's side, the vibrations of its pained roars rattling his teeth. He pulled himself up onto its massive, scaled flank, the obsidian plates slick with blood and seawater. He scrambled towards the gills, his spear held ready. The golden eye, vast and filled with ancient hatred, swiveled and fixed on him. It saw the tiny man on its body. It opened its maw for one final, defiant roar. At that exact moment, Jorn on the cliff played his part. He let out a great war cry and hurled not a harpoon, but a large boulder that his team had prepared. The boulder hurtled down and smashed onto Forlag's head. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was enough. The beast's head reeled from the impact, its attention diverted for a single, crucial second. That was the only opening Cale needed. With a scream that was a release of all his fear, his grief, and his hope, he plunged his flint-tipped spear with all his strength into the pale flesh behind the gill slit. He put the entire weight of his body into the thrust. The flint point, sharp as a razor, sank deep into the soft tissue, finding its way to the vital organs within. A shudder ran through the entire length of the Leviathan. A tremor, as if a mountain were collapsing from the inside out. The great golden eye dimmed, the fire within it extinguishing like a dying ember. A final, shuddering sigh escaped its lungs, a gust of foul air that nearly threw Cale from his perch. And then Forlag was still. The thrashing stopped. The roars ceased. The only sound was the rushing of the receding tide and the dripping of water and blood from the immense, lifeless body. Silence. A profound, echoing silence fell over the serpent's spine. The men on the cliffs stood like statues, staring in disbelief. Down below, Cale clung to the side of the dead god, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, his arm buried to the elbow in the creature he had slain. The battle was over. The aftermath was one of weary, solemn triumph. The Gara had won. They had faced their extinction and had met it with courage and ingenuity. As the tide fell further, it left the colossal corpse of Forlag beached among the rocks, a testament to their impossible victory. They mourned their losses, Ren and 3 other men who had been swept from the cliffs or struck by falling rock during the battle. But their grief was now mingled with an overwhelming pride. It took them a week to butcher the beast. Its flesh fed the tribe for months. Its hide provided leather for 100 new cloaks. Its teeth and bones were carved into new tools, new weapons, new ornaments. Its obsidian scales were prized as marks of honor. The bay, once a place of terror, became a larder of unimaginable bounty. The Gara were not just saved. They were prosperous. Cale was no longer Cale the quiet observer. He was Cale the Leviathan Slayer. He did not seek the role of Chief Durak still led. His wisdom now bolstered by Cale's counsel, but he was the tribe's heart. He had led them through the darkness not by being the strongest or the loudest, but by seeing what others could not, by trusting the wisdom of the past, and by uniting his people toward a single, desperate purpose. One evening, weeks later, Cale stood on the high ledge, looking out at the now peaceful sea. The water of Whispering Bay was once again a vibrant blue, and the cries of the gulls filled the air. Alara stood beside him, her old eyes fixed on the horizon. "The ancestors are pleased," she said. Cale nodded, feeling the smooth, cool charmed stone in his pocket. He looked back towards the great cave. In the firelight, he could see a new painting taking shape on the wall. It was not a simple hunt. It was a grand story. A tiny canoe, a great serpent trapped in a reef, men on cliffs, and a single figure on the back of the beast, delivering the final blow. They were not just painting a hunt. They were painting a legend. The story of how the Gara, a small tribe of people on the edge of the world, faced a god of the deep and emerged victorious. It was a story that would be told for 1,000 generations. A story of fear, despair, and the unconquerable spirit of a people who refused to be devoured by the dark. The shadow on the water was gone, and in its place, a new dawn was breaking for the Gara.